Okay. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome Dr. Megaera Lorenz to uh, to our weekly lecture series. She's a Egyptologist. Also a Smithsonian Journeys expert. If you ever get the opportunity, she guides people on tours to Egypt, and she's her background. She specializes in the history, art, and iconography of Egypt's New Kingdom. Welcome. I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Today I'm going to be talking about a small aspect of the research I did for my dissertation at the University of Chicago. Um, it was the topic was royal sons in the 18th dynasty. So the children of kings, who interestingly enough are actually very enigmatic figures during that period. They're much less clearly present in the historical record than female relatives of the king. And part of the reason for this is that they had a more complicated role in terms of the actual ideological nature of the royal family. Royal women could be kind of slotted into roles relative to the king that matched the mythological roles of various goddesses. Whereas male relatives of the king, that was a little bit more of difficult territory, which I'll get into a little bit more in a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. Sorry, my computer is being a little difficult. Um, oh, I see. Sorry about this. I didn't anticipate that it would give me this much trouble. All right, I'm going to try this again. I'm actually going to have to leave the call briefly and come back, so I'll be with you in just a second.
How's everybody doing today?
Okay.
All right, I made you co-host again, so you should be.
There we go. Perfect. All right, thank you. Okay. Let me get this into the right mode. Okay, so I will be talking about the title, specifically the kinship title, King's Son of His Body during the 18th Dynasty. Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about royal kinship titles in ancient Egypt and just Egyptian kinship titles in a more general sense. So royal kinship titles specifically are titles that express familial or familial type relationships within the royal family. And these can be literal kinship relationships or they can be figurative. So these titles almost always express relationships in terms of how the title bearer is related to the king. The king is the central figure in the royal family. So we see titles like King's Son, which is the focus of my talk today, but also the feminine equivalent King's Daughter, King's Sister and King's Wife, and also King's Mother. You'll notice that King's Brother is completely absent from this list. That was a title that did not appear during most periods of Egyptian history because it was considered problematic. These titles fit into a mythological template for the royal or divine family. And the title brother had indications of equality that were considered problematic because of the notion of somebody else being equal to the king. So that kind of sibling relationship between a king and another male figure was something that was simply not expressed except under very special circumstances. Before I get more specifically into these royal titles, I want to talk in general about ancient Egyptian kinship terminology. The Egyptians used a much more limited range of kinship titles than what we are used to in English. So the main titles are Sa and Sat, son and daughter, Sen and Senet, brother and sister, and Eat and Mut, father and mother. And that was it. That was the core set of kinship terms that was used in various ways to express all kinds of familial relationships. So if you wanted to express other kinds of relationships, you could do it by creating these compound kinship terms. So for example, a grandparent, a grandfather might be my father's father. Um, an uncle could be, my mother's brother. So you would just kind of stack these titles together. But there were no actual words for grandparents, grandchildren, cousins, aunts and uncles, or nieces and nephews, or any of those other types of more extended lineal and collateral relationships. But in addition to these compound kinship terms, the basic core kinship terms could also be used in extended or metaphorical ways to express different or more complicated relationships. When I say extended, I mean, taking one of these base kinship terms and using it to describe a different kind of familial relationship. So for example, you could use brother or sister to express other kinds of collateral relationships. So if you call somebody sen or senet, that could also mean an aunt or uncle, a nephew or a niece, or even a cousin. And you could also use father or mother to indicate more generally an ancestor, a grandparent, a great-grandparent. And similarly, son or daughter could be used for grandchildren. But in addition to these extended kinship terms, we also have what are called metaphorical uses of kinship terms. And this is something that is actually familiar to most English speakers. So for example, if you talk about, the father of my country or the mother of modern anthropology, or you refer to somebody as a brother or sister, meaning that they are, somebody you consider very close to you, even if they're not actually related to you by blood. So these kinds of metaphorical uses of kinship terms existed in ancient Egypt. So for example, you could use the term father to mean somebody, who was more of a tutor or a mentor. Son or daughter could be used to express things like a student, a servant, a dependent, an in-law, somebody with a legal relationship, like a legal heir, a trustee. Similarly, sister or brother could express anything from, equal or compatriot to a rival, a spouse. In fact, the term sen or senet basically means second. So it had this sense of, a double, an equal, somebody who is on the same level. So these extended and metaphorical uses of kinship terms also show up in royal contexts, which can make it very difficult to understand what the actual relationships were between these people. And in particular, the king's son title is problematic because not only can it be used to express a variety of different types of relationships, but these meanings, the meanings of these terms can change over time. So it's not always clear what you're dealing with when you're presented with a king's son in the historical record. So the title King's Son, or Sa Nisut, and its feminine equivalent Sat Nisut, goes all the way back to the early dynastic period. So it originates almost from the very beginning of recorded history in Egypt. from very early on, we also start to see these variants. The most common variants are Sanisut Semsu, which translates to King's eldest son, and Sanisut Enhetef, King's son of his body. And you also start to see early on combinations of these titles. For example, King's eldest son of his body, sometimes with other little variants added on, King's eldest son of his body, his beloved, and so on. And there are both masculine and feminine versions of these titles. So at first, these titles seem to specifically refer to biological children of the king, but by the end of the Fourth Dynasty, still in the Old Kingdom, we are starting to see both extended and metaphorical uses of these titles. So, for example, the base term Sanisut, King's son, can be used to refer to both royal sons and royal grandsons, and that seems to be also the case with king's daughters. As the Old Kingdom progressed, by the end of the Fourth Dynasty, we start to see more and more non-relatives of the king playing important roles within the royal administration, and specifically taking over roles that used to be reserved for members of the royal family. So at this point, we start to see honorific uses of these titles. And in the meantime, actual biological king's sons are being pushed out of the administration more and more. So we start to see people with titles like King's eldest son, or even King's son of his body, who are apparently not actually related to the king in any way. And we know this because, oftentimes we'll see somebody with this title appearing, for example, in the titles listed in their funerary monuments. But then their parents are also named, and their parents will be non-royal people. So it's quite clear that in these cases, we're not looking at literal king's sons. So these major variants, King's son of his body and King's eldest son, seem to be used in ways that do not directly reflect their literal meaning. The title King's eldest son not only can be used honorifically, but when it is used by actual king's sons, it doesn't necessarily seem to indicate anything about birth order. We will have one king with several eldest sons. One possibility is that the eldest there refers to the eldest surviving son, but this doesn't seem to be the case. For example, Khafre had several eldest sons who seem to have survived him and continued to use that title. A more likely possibility is that the eldest referred to the eldest son of each queen if the king was married to multiple queens, but it doesn't seem to have been used that way consistently. The Enhetef, king's son of his body title, is in some ways even more confusing, because this idea of the king's son of his body seems to very much suggest a biological relationship. But again, it's used for people who were not actually biologically related to the king, and that is clearly established. So other Egyptologists who have looked at these titles during the Old Kingdom speculated that they were some sort of titles of rank, indicating a relatively high-ranking position of the people who carried these titles within the administration. Maybe something to do with the kinds of administrative duties that they would have had, but not necessarily directly relevant to their relationship to the king or birth order or anything of that sort. But unfortunately, we just don't have enough evidence at this point to come up with a very clear picture of what these titles indicated. Now, after the end of the Old Kingdom, we have a bit of a gap in the evidence. While these titles are still in use, particularly among king's daughters, there is very little evidence that they continue to be used for royal sons, and just little evidence in general about what royal sons were doing between the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the New Kingdom. So we have an entire period there, first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, and second intermediate period, where there's very little evidence for what's going on with these titles. And then at the beginning of the 18th dynasty, there seems to have been a revival in these titles, and also a new emphasis on actually representing king's sons in royal monuments and private monuments. And this seems to have something to do with this attempt at the beginning of the 18th dynasty to reconnect with earlier traditions. So there was an intentional revival of these titles that had been in use during the Old Kingdom. But we also get new titles, new variants. So there's a huge array of these titles for royal sons that shows up during the 18th dynasty. And these are some examples. So we have Sa-Nisut, king's son, Sa-Nisut Semsu, king's eldest son, Sa-Nisut Enhetef, king's son of his body, Sa-Nisut Meref, king's son, his beloved, Sa-Nisut Ma'a-Meref, true king's son, his beloved, and then some other odd ones, Pa-Yiru-Nisut, the one whom the king created, Sawechet Iker, the excellent egg, which is a mythological reference to this idea of the god Horus, who is associated with kingship, being an egg in the nest before he grew up to be an adult and took his place on his father's throne. So, interestingly enough, by the time the 18th dynasty rolls around, it seems like the practice of using these titles metaphorically or for non-royal individuals has gone out of use. The expression king's son is still sometimes used metaphorically, but in very specific, limited, and fairly clear-cut contexts. So, for example, at this point, and just for context, the 18th dynasty lasted from around 1550 BC to 1330s or 1320s BC. So at this point, we start to see these very limited metaphorical uses, including titles like Sa-Nisut and Cush, king's son of Cush, which was the title of the king's representative in Nubia, and also first king's son of Amun, which is a priestly title. And in these cases, it seems like the term king's son is being used to indicate that this person is the king's proxy or representative in these contexts. Otherwise, if you see somebody called king's son, you can more or less assume that they are at least a member of the royal family, even if they're not actually a king's son. It's possible that we're talking about grandchildren or other types of descendants. But I'll get more into that in a moment. One of the reasons it's so difficult in the 18th dynasty to pin down the relationships between king's sons and their parents is that the exact parentage of king's sons at this period is never specified. It's always implied. So if you see a royal monument with a king's son in it, he will be given the title king's son, but it will not ever say, son of, and then the name of the reigning king, for example. So you have to kind of draw these conclusions from the context. If a royal son appears, if somebody with the title king's son appears on a monument with a king, it's a reasonable guess that that king is his father, but it's not always the case. For example, you'll sometimes see monuments associated with these royal ancestor cults where several royal figures will appear together who date to different parts of the 18th dynasty, and they are being put together because they are all associated with this royal ancestor cult, but not necessarily because they are directly, immediately related to each other. So actually reconstructing the history of the 18th dynasty royal family can be extremely complicated. Um, Another interesting aspect of this situation is that king's daughters, who appear much more frequently in monuments of this period, their parents could be named directly. So there's definitely a difference here between the way male and female members of the royal family are presented in terms of their relationships to the king. We do have some indirect evidence that the king's son title could be used in an extended sense during this period. Um, for example, we have a mummy label of an 18th dynasty princess named Nebatia, who was named as a king's daughter and also as a daughter of a king's son. So this is a case where the title Zat Nisut, king's daughter, is being used to describe a royal granddaughter. Again, this is indirect evidence because this is a princess. We don't actually have a lot of clear evidence for the title being used this way for royal sons. There is also a situation where Tutankhamun, in a monument that he created after kingship, refers to an earlier king, Amenhotep III, as his father, and it's more likely that Amenhotep III would have been his grandfather. But again, this is not direct evidence because we don't actually know what the relationship was between those two kings. It's based on guesswork and circumstantial evidence. So one of the things that I found as I was sifting through this evidence was that it's difficult to pinpoint whether any of these titles had any kind of implication in terms of future kingship. It has been generally assumed by Egyptologists that the title King's Eldest Son during the 18th dynasty would have been the title used to indicate the heir. And that makes sense. The title Eldest Son had been used to refer to heirs in non-royal settings since very early in Egyptian history. It was essentially a legal term. So the eldest son was supposed to be the primary heir to their parents' property, offices, and so on. In fact, eventually the term eldest son in non-royal context became a legal term to the extent where people who were neither eldest nor a son could take on this title. In fact, you have examples, I believe, from the Ptolemaic period of daughters taking on this title of eldest son so that they could inherit their parents' property. So it would make sense that in royal settings, the eldest son would also be the heir to the throne. However, interestingly enough, when you actually look at the evidence, it doesn't really hold up. So there is no clear-cut evidence, even going back to earlier periods, that the title Sanisut Semsu, or King's Eldest Son, indicated heir status. It does seem to have been some kind of title of rank in the Old Kingdom, but it's not clear what exactly the implication was. If we look at the 18th dynasty, other Egyptologists who have looked at this period, some of them have assumed that King's eldest son referred to the heir, whereas others have looked at it not as an indication of heir status, but as an indication of just literal birth order, not necessarily anything else. Since it seems like, in general, kings in the 18th dynasty, unlike in earlier periods, could not have more than one Sanisut Semsu. There was one eldest son per king. But it's also assumed generally that the eldest son would have a stronger claim to the throne than his siblings. However, there are some issues with this assumption. One of the main problems that I found was that we have 7 known individuals during the 18th dynasty who used this title, king's eldest son. Only one of them eventually became king. That was Thutmose IV. And his only known use of the title is from a monument that was created after he had already come to the throne. There's also a certain amount of evidence, which I'll get into shortly, that he was never the intended heir to the throne. And in fact, the prince who was supposed to step up actually died before he was able to take the throne. Now we do see that these royal sons who hold this title are more prominent in the historical record than other king's sons. They tend to hold higher offices, in particular priestly and military offices, and they're also more likely to appear in royal monuments, which in general is very unusual for the 18th dynasty. You do not typically see king's sons appearing in monuments of the reigning king at all. It became much more common in the 19th dynasty, but that was a very different kind of political situation. So we also, we see that these sons held these kinds of priestly and military offices, but actual reigning kings, when they talk about their pre-kingship activities and offices that they might have held, they don't seem to have done the same sorts of things. So we don't have clear-cut evidence of 18th dynasty kings holding the kinds of offices that were attested for eldest sons in surviving pre-kingship monuments. So next I want to move on to another title that saw a revival during the 18th dynasty, which was Sa, Nisut, and Hetep. So after a long period of disuse among royal males for this title, between the end of the Old Kingdom and the beginning of the New Kingdom, it suddenly reappears in the 18th dynasty. It had been in use for female royal children continuously during this entire period. So it was used by princesses all throughout, the Middle Kingdom and the intermediate periods. During the 18th dynasty, we know of 6 princes who used this title or variants of the title, King's Son of His Body. Possibly 7 if you include a unique variant used by an early 18th dynasty prince called Ahmose Ankh, but I'll be getting to that shortly. So of the princes who held the King's Son of His Body title during the 18th dynasty, 3 of them actually did go on to become kings. Those are Thutmose IV, who was also a king's eldest son, and again, for both titles, the only known have is after he became king, so it's a retrospective reference to his pre-kingship titles. Also Amenhotep III and Tutankhamun, who was otherwise known as Tutankhaten. There were 3 more princes that we know from this period who also held the title King's Son of His Body, but who died young. But all 3 of them received special funerary honors that are not paralleled by any other royal sons during this period. So, let me see. So these would have been Wajmosa, a king's son of his body, and a son of Thutmose III. So this was early in the Thutmose I, early in the 18th dynasty. His burial place is unknown, but we know that he received a mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, which is an honor that's almost exclusive to kings during this time period. And eventually this temple became the focal point of a royal ancestor cult during the 18th dynasty, and then it continued on later into the New Kingdom. In fact, Ramses II in the 19th dynasty chose to build his mortuary temple directly adjacent to this temple. So this prince was eventually incorporated into a Theban royal ancestor cult that was centered at Deir el-Medina, along with other very honored figures of the early 18th dynasty, like Ahmose and Nefertari and Thutmose I. Another prince who held the title Sanisut and Hetep, who seems to have predeceased his father, was Weben-Senu, a son of Amenhotep II, who was actually buried in his father's tomb. And that was also extremely rare for this period. We have royal women sometimes being buried in the tombs of kings, but in general, not any male relatives, except for a couple of these princes who seem to have held this special title. Weben-Senu might also have been the owner of one or more defaced monuments at Giza, which seem to have been associated with a cult practiced by members of the royal family associated with the Great Sphinx. So this was, again, a way for the 18th dynasty royal family to make a connection with the the royal family of the Old Kingdom, which seems to have been an intentional attempt to try to establish legitimacy by creating some kind of continuity with this earlier royal family. So these monuments at Giza, a couple of which may have belonged to Weben-Senu based on traces of his name that are still remaining on the monuments. They use a lot of royal imagery and language that was usually reserved for kings. These princes have their names written in cartouches, which was normally something associated with kingship. They use kingly epithets, and these monuments were at some point intentionally destroyed, and it seems likely that it was because they were not ideologically acceptable after a different son, Thutmose IV, ended up becoming king. So both this prince Weben-Senu on his canopic jars, which you see one of them represented here, and in one of these stelae had the title Overseer of Horses, which also connects to the kinds of pre-kingship activities that we do have attested in the 18th dynasty. For example, in the monuments of Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV, who both talked about their activities raising and caring for and racing royal horses before they became kings. Finally, we have Amenemhet C, who is a prince depicted in a private tomb, the tomb of this tutor of the royal sons, alongside the reigning king, Thutmose IV, and several other princes. And this is another case where this prince was buried in the tomb of his father, which again was highly unusual for this period. And one interesting minor detail about this representation of Amenemhet is that you can't see it in this particular slide, but I'll point it out later. He's shown holding a chick in his hand, which was, again, a symbol that was associated with the fledgling Horus, this god who had links to eventual kingship. And this scene is problematic for a few different reasons, but I'll get back to that shortly. So, my hypothesis is that during the 18th dynasty, at least, the title Sanisut and Hetep, king's son of his body, may have been the designation for the heir or the crown prince. So the supporting evidence for this idea is that we have a relatively strong correlation between the use of this title and eventual kingship. It's not much to go on, since only 3 of them actually did come to the throne as far as we know, but it's stronger than anything else we have, certainly a much stronger correlation than we have for king's eldest son. We also have special funerary honors being given to princes who held this particular title, such as burial in royal tombs, and these mortuary chapels, which were usually reserved for kings. Most princes of the 18th dynasty, for whom we have any evidence of where they were either buried in their own tombs or with groups of female relatives. So it was highly unusual for them to be placed in the tomb along with their father. And we also have this evidence that in the form of these monuments from Giza, that some of these princes were actually in line for kingship because of the use of kingly epithets and offices and activities that we see in retrospective accounts of pre-kingship activities and in the monuments of later reigning kings. One interesting element of these monuments is that aside from overseer of horses, we don't see these princes using a lot of specific titles of office, as opposed to princes who hold the title king's eldest son. We see king's eldest sons in the 18th dynasty holding military offices, priestly offices, but these king's son of his body princes, we don't have a lot of indications of what they were doing in terms of holding offices or administrative activities. So it's possible that the title Sa Nisut al-Hetef itself was the title of office that encompassed a variety of military, administrative, and religious duties that would prepare the title holder eventually for the office of the king. Also, another interesting element of this title, which I will get into a lot more briefly, momentarily, is that En-Hetef, or of his body, was also used as a kingly epithet. It was used by reigning kings to express their relationship to gods. So you will see kings calling themselves son of Ra, of his body. This was something that was used in several 18th dynasty royal monuments. There are, of course, some problems with this hypothesis. One is that we have this tiny sample size. It's really not very much to go on. We also have no clear precedent for the En-Hetef title having anything to do with heir status in earlier periods, so it's not something where we can look back to the Old Kingdom and say, okay, that's how it was used then, so that's clearly the way it's being used during the 18th dynasty. There's also this odd issue of this scene in the private tomb, Theban tomb 64 that I mentioned earlier, where two princes and the reigning king are all given the king's eldest son title together in one scene. However, sorry, let's see, here we go. Is my microphone still on?
Yes, your microphone is still on.
Okay, great, thank you. So the issue here, and this is an interesting look at the way temporal relationships are represented in Egyptian art. So this is from the tomb of a royal tutor who was responsible in part for raising these princes and teaching them. And he, Hekarnehe, is represented here. He is the son of Hekareshu, who was also a royal tutor. So this was a generational job, apparently. So the older tutor is here holding Thutmose IV, who was reigning king at the time that this tomb was decorated. But he's being represented as a child or a miniature adult. And he is dressed as a king, but clearly represented with the kind of relationship that he had with his tutor as a child. And then the son is approaching, honoring his father and the king that he raised, while accompanied by several princes who were apparently in his care. So, while at first glance, the idea that there could be three different king's sons of his body in one scene like this, it would seem to indicate maybe it doesn't, maybe that doesn't have anything to do with heir status. Otherwise, you wouldn't see three of them grouped together like this. But this is obviously not supposed to represent a single coherent moment in time. We have two different generations here, and because the relationships between princes and their parents is never clearly spelled out, we don't even know if all of these younger princes belong to the same generation. So Thutmose IV here is being represented both as a king and as a king's eldest son of his body. At the same time, we have a king's son of his body here, who is probably a son of Thutmose IV. And then this other one here, the Amenemhet C, whom I talked about earlier, who never did come to the throne, but was buried in Thutmose IV's tomb. So potentially he had already passed away at the time that this scene was created. And Amenhotep here is the current heir. So I don't consider this to be particularly problematic in I don't think that this is necessarily strong evidence against the title King's Son of his body being used to indicate the status of heir during this period. Okay, so this brings up the question, what exactly did the title King's Son of his body mean? It seems to indicate, in a literal sense, a biological relationship to the king. But since, with few exceptions, all king's sons during this period seems to have been biologically related to the king, it seems like there must be something else going on. So I have looked at this very early monument of the 18th dynasty to try to get a better sense of how the term was being used. So this is called the donation stela of Ahmose Nefertari, which shows the queen Ahmose Nefertari and the king Ahmose with their son Ahmose Ankh, who did not actually end up becoming the next king. Instead it was Amenhotep I. But it seems as though he's being presented as his parents' heir in this scene. They show the king and the queen with the son approaching the god Amun, who is the patron deity of the 18th dynasty royal family, and they're making offerings. And the king's son here is given a unique variant on the king's son of his body title. He is called the king's eldest son of the god's limbs. So of the god's limbs or body, again, has this indication of having come from the body of the king, who is presumably the god who's being referred to in this situation. And in fact, the royal family here is being represented as a typical divine triad. But interestingly enough, if you look at the text of this monument, it's focusing on Ahmose Ankh being the heir to his mother's titles and offices. She was a high-ranking priestess of Amun, the god's wife of Amun, which ties into a more strongly developed idea that we see later in the 18th dynasty, that the queen would ritually couple with the god Amun, and the child who would result was supposed to be literally the son of the earthly king, but also the son of the god Amun. So in this case, at least, there's a strong implication that the god who is being referred to in his title, of the god's limbs, is not necessarily the king, or not only the king, but also the god Amun. So this suggests that in the more common version of the title, King's Son of his body, the body being referred to is not necessarily the body of the king, but also possibly the body of the god. And we can see a similar use in the kingly epithet, son of Ra, or son of Amun-Ra, of his body. So if we here is the actual title written out. Sa Nisut Semsu and Hau Necher, King's eldest son of the god's limbs. So as the 18th dynasty progressed, there was this elaborate mythos of divine birth that develops. It's first fully expressed during the reign of Hatshepsut, where her divine conception and birth is represented in her mortuary temple. So the idea is that kingship was predetermined before conception even, and the future king was the product of the sacred union between the human mother and Amun-Ra, who would appear to her in the form of the reigning king. So if we do accept that Sa-Nisut and Khetep means crown prince during the 18th dynasty, that means that we would have to reassess the sort of traditional ideas that Egyptologists have had about the standard career trajectory for the heir to the throne. If we assume that Semsu, or eldest son, Sa-Nisut Semsu, indicated heir status, then we would also have to assume that heirs were very prominently represented in royal monuments. They tended to hold high religious and military offices, but this does not seem to have been the case. We also have to reassess some assumptions about royal burial practices during the 18th dynasty. For example, that these princes being buried in their fathers' tombs were just there out of practicality or convenience, because, for example, their actual intended burial places had not been completed at the time that they died. But if these king's sons of his body who were buried in the royal tombs were actually heirs, then their presence in the king's tomb makes a lot more sense. As predestined kings or extensions of the body of the reigning king, they were parts of the god's body, like their fathers, and therefore it would make sense for them to be buried in the tomb of the king. So just to wrap up, this leaves a lot of questions unanswered. For example, if not heir, what did the title King's Eldest Son actually signify during this period, or during earlier periods for that matter? Is it possible that this title originally indicated heir status in the 18th dynasty, but the meaning changed, or that both titles had something to do with succession? And also, what were the implications of the feminine equivalents of these titles, which were both used during the 18th dynasty? Did they possibly correlate with eventual queenship, or with burial in royal tombs, or with the presence of these women in certain kinds of ritual settings? I don't have these answers at this point, but it's possible that with a closer analysis of the evidence, we could find some interesting answers to these questions. I do feel ultimately that there is a fairly convincing case to be made that the title King's Son of his body did indicate heir status, but I am much less sure about what King's eldest son would indicate. I'm not ready to completely reject the idea that eldest son had something to do with heir status, but I don't think that there's a lot of convincing evidence to support it at this point. So that is what I have for you, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the time that we have left.
All right, if anyone has questions, drop them in the chat window, and we'll go from there. So I have a question. That's,
Sure.
I mean, it's not really a, I don't know how to word it. The biblical story of Moses,
Uh-huh.
and when you were talking about the uh, the queen and the son that is the son of Ammon, or the from the limbs of Ammon.
Right.
I mean, would that be something, you know, I don't even know how to word this question. You get the gist of where I'm going with this? How that could be, you know, misinterpreted as in the biblical sense?
Um, Possibly. So, with the idea of this sort of um, divine conception, or
Well, I meant more like how they found, supposedly found Moses in the river,
uh-huh,
and they took him in
right.
as as a child of Pharaoh or whatever.
Uh-huh.
I'm wondering if that could have been like, I mean, I don't want to step on anybody's toes that's Christian or anything like that, but I mean, could have been misinterpreted
Uh-huh.
or reinterpreted in the Bible to say that was the Moses, that son of Pharaoh was Moses actually, or something like that.
Uh-huh.
I know I'm not wording this very well, but it's just something that occurred to me when you're on that when you're talking on that slide.
Right. It's possible. I guess it's a topic that's difficult to get into because we don't know how the idea of adoption, for example, would have been viewed in the context of the royal family. Um, it's something that we know about from non-royal contexts where somebody could take somebody into their family and make them a son legally, or a daughter. But yeah, I'm not sure how it would potentially tie into the biblical story.
Yeah, and then beyond the biblical story, my wheels started turning in my head. I'm like thinking, well, is this a child that was adopted and he's not actual blood relative of the Pharaoh, and that's why they called him the I forget the term, but the son of the limbs of the god or whatever.
Yeah,
So I don't just questions that arose in my mind as you were talking about it.
yeah. Again, it's one of those things where, I mean, beyond DNA testing,
Yeah,
uh,
I understand.
which would seem to indicate that there is some kind of continuity going on there. But yeah, since these relationships are they're really tiptoeing around them. In fact, there is a case of an 18th dynasty monument um, that belonged to a um, a person who does not call himself a king's son at any point, but he calls himself one who was born to a king's mother, which seems to be a very delicate, politically appropriate way of saying that he's the king's brother, which, as I said earlier, was taboo. Couldn't
Hmm.
come right out and say, I'm the king's brother. So they had to use this very circuitous way to express that relationship.
Yeah, I could totally see that in the different terms how they're kind of pussyfooting around the topic
Yeah.
and at the time obviously they knew what that meant, but you uh, as an Egyptologist, thousands of years later are looking at this like what exactly they're trying to say here. you know but I thought it was great. I mean, does anyone have any questions that aren't as obscure as mine? I know Bella's interested in Egyptology. Surely you've got a question. Is she still here? Let's see. I think she's still on the. She's probably mad at me for putting her on the spot. Bella, are you still? Let's see. Maybe she's. I'll put it in the chat and see. She also works during this time,
Yeah.
so she works at the university, so she may have the meeting on and just muted or something.
Right.
Well, I don't want to hold you too much longer. If we got no questions, would it be all right if people emailed you if they had a question later?
Absolutely.
Okay, and we also record this and we put it on our YouTube channel, and I'll send you a link once we get it up,
Okay.
because a lot of people can't attend during the noon hour,
Right.
and that's just the traditional time we do this. So we do get quite a few views after we've posted it. So I will provide you with that link as well if you'd like to share it with your friends or colleagues or whatever. But we want to thank you so much for being our honored guest today, and hope to. I mean, we'd love to have you again talking on other topics on Egyptology, maybe next semester, if
Okay,
you're available.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. You have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye bye.